listening to an El Seminario production, a multi-generational, family-owned media company, capturing conversation that reflects our communities since 1989. Whether we answer your questions or inspire new ones, at El Seminario, we speak your language. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to this week's episode of We Speak Your Language. I'm your host, Vivian Reyes. In this episode, we're diving deep into an often overlooked topic, the profound effects of immigration on mental health and how our community copes with the trauma, stress, and uncertainties that come along with living under the weight of illegality. As we engage in this discussion, we must acknowledge that the border did not just cross us. It has impacted us for generations, shaping our history and our families. How has this trauma influenced our mental health, and how can we continue to rise and support one another in the face of adversity? Joining us today are experts and advocates who work on the front lines of mental health within the Latinx community. Let me introduce our wonderful guests, Dr. Luis Torres and Andrea Loya. Dr. Luis Torres is a longtime educator and administrator, having taught in higher education since 1972. Dr. Torres has witnessed the generational impact of immigration policy on our youth and families. Andrea Loya is the executive director of Casa de Paz, a nonprofit organization that welcomes recently released newcomers, asylum seekers, and immigrants. They facilitate their next steps towards reunification with loved ones in a dignifying way. Let's begin by examining the broader context. I'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Torres. Given your experience with the evolution of immigration laws over the decades, particularly since 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, how have these changes influenced the idea of illegality? Additionally, what impact has this had on the mental health of our community?
Well, thank you. First, it's important to realize that there have been numerous immigration laws in the United States, numerous immigration periods, and I think the term evolution in your question is very applicable here because they have evolved. They have changed a great deal, sometimes going back and forth and so on. You mentioned the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, but that was signed, that was a very important one. It was signed by then President Lyndon Johnson following the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act. Think back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the civil rights workers who helped achieve that 1964 Civil Rights Act. 1965, of course, was the Voting Rights Act, which evolved from the Civil Rights Act, as did to a certain extent the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that you mentioned. We have to go back, though. For example, and I'm not going to go back and be really extremely thorough on this, but 1882, that's right, 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was extended in 1892, 10 years later, 82, then 92. And as its name implies, it was an absolute exclusion of Chinese laborers, male Chinese laborers. So male Chinese laborers could not come into the U.S. They did go to Mexico. So there was a long-term Chinese influence in Mexico. Dr. Evelyn Hugh DeHart, as I was doing some research, she indicated that the first, and this is her term for irony's sake, the first illegal aliens who came into the U.S., again, that's her term, she used it advisedly for irony, the first illegal aliens from Mexico into the U.S. were actually Chinese. Mm-hmm. They were trying to get into the U.S. That Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943. in the US, 1947 in Canada. But to go back, there was an Immigration Act of 1917, the Literacy Act, which wanted to impose restrictions on immigrants by imposing literacy tests in English. Well, if somebody comes in who's perfectly fine in speaking in Spanish or some other language, but not English, they were purposely excluded. That was amended in 1924, revised again in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which abolished direct racial barriers. And then that one was amended for the National Immigration and Nationality Act that you mentioned, 1965. That one abolished the national origins formula. There was actually a formula. It abolished quotas, specific numbers from specific countries, which were intended to continue U.S. homogeneity, I would say, of Northern Europeans. Think Germans, British, Ireland, and so on. But it also tried to assist those who could contribute most to this country. In other words, that was one of the rules and regulations. And this is very, very important. They wanted to base it on family ties, family reunification. 75% of the quota, it wasn't really a quota, but approximately 75% of those who would be admitted in order to reunify families. 20% for employment. I apologize. 20% for employment, only 5% for refugees, but that was a number. So we're up to 65, and very, very quickly, remember in 1953, 1954, I've got to say this term, Operation Wetback, right? By then President Eisenhower, which removed at least 1 million Latinos, Mexicanos, other Latinos, including U.S. citizens, including U.S. citizen children. And then this will take about 30 seconds. IRCA, IRCA in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which legalized the immigrants who were already here, but it made it illegal to hire undocumented immigrants by employers. Prohibited discrimination based on immigration status, except for that inability to hire. And then there have been others. That was the 1986 IRCA. This year, 2024, to see how often the immigration laws change. This year, there was another effort for the Department of Homeland Security. They even called it Keeping Families Together, a process for certain non-citizen spouses and non-citizen stepchildren of U.S. citizens to request parole in place. So my point is, it changes just all the time. If one asks a question about immigration, we also have to ask, are you talking about asylees, asylum, refugees, and so on? So it's very, very difficult for somebody here in my office, right, to think about all these points. Imagine somebody fleeing a very, very difficult country, coming into the U.S., being faced with this amalgam, this combination of rules and regulations.
Thank you. It's honestly crucial to understand that the concept of illegality has not always existed. Andrea, since you work closely with immigrant families at Casa de Paz, how have you observed the impact of this label on their mental health? What is the psychological toll it takes on them?
I think the biggest thing that we can take away from what Dr. Torres in your question is the fact that all of this confusion actually, and all of these laws and all of these things that change all the time, and then our immigration system being such a lottery itself, ultimately people don't really understand the way that our system works, because we don't really understand the way our system works, because our system doesn't understand the way it works. And so I think it's created this confusion. It's created a lot of what we have seen now to what's gotten us to the state, as far as like why certain people don't see themselves within the same groups that they actually belong in, because there's so much confusion about to like what legality is. To the point of Dr. Torres, there's so many different, like it was legal in one point and then it wasn't legal anymore and then it was legal again, and so it's just like the switch back and forth. And so what it does is when people are coming over and they're seeking a better life, instead of a system that actually is able to serve them, is able to take them to a due process, what they find is folks are now in detention. So there's about 37,000 people currently in immigrant detention centers as we speak. And what we see is that this system that's created this label is so confusing and people don't understand it. So they get here and then they don't even realize that they're going to be caged, because to their understanding, they have the right to seek asylum. They have the right to come over. They have the right to be able to seek a better life, right? And so now, instead of being able to have that, we've created a system that is so confusing that instead of where people can actually seek asylum, where people can actually come and do a better life, where people can come and work, where they can do all these things, they can no longer do that. They're now facing all these things, and what we see is detention itself is very dehumanizing. It does not matter necessarily where you're detained. What we know from what we see people at CASA and people who have been in different detention centers is that typically detention centers in the southern states or in red states are much worse in treatment. And so now we're talking about a population of people who is already traumatized, because that's why they're seeking asylum. That's why they're fleeing. They're not in the best conditions in their own countries, and that's why they're leaving. And so then instead we're further actually damaging them. We're actually further making their mental health worse, because these facilities are not necessarily that great. 24 hours, 7 days a week, lights on, and someone treating you like you're less than human because you don't have a paper to be here is not a way that I can figure somebody imagining a better life for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Kind of touching on that as a follow-up question to what you just shared, you obviously you encounter individuals who have endured unimaginable trauma, like you just touched on, being separated from their families, detained, and then released. How does this experience exacerbate the mental health challenges that immigrants face, especially when they return to a society that views them as outsiders?
You know, a lot of people come out of detention and they're coming out, and not only have we as a system put them through all of these dehumanizing things where they're not detained. A lot of people experience their first airplane ride shackled, because their first airplane ride is the ride that GEO and ICE gives them, or ICE and whatever the other contract facility is at the border. And so to think that that's your first flying experience, to think that that's your first experience on a plane, to think that a lot of your first experiences in a country and your first welcome was actually shackles, and then to go back into a society that also sees you as less than because now you're seeking asylum or because you don't have the status or whatever the case may be, is so dehumanizing. I mean, there is so much of the obstacles of where we're at, right? Where we are as immigrants, and this is speaking from an immigrant background. As immigrants, when we come to this country, you're focused on your basic stuff. You're focused on meeting your ends rent. You're focused on your next meal. You're focused on your next paycheck. You're focused on your family's like next shoes, next kind of cycle of like the year of school supplies and all of these things, right? And so to add now the detention portion to that, and then to add now the stigma of who you are just because you're seeking asylum or just because you're not from here, it is only going to further exacerbate like the detrimental effects on our mental health. Because how are we ever going to get to really be out of this cycle if we are never fully able to take care of those needs, essentially?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let's discuss the impact of generational trauma. Again, Andrea, you work closely with both youth and families who have experienced the trauma of immigration. How do you perceive the effects of generational trauma on both parents and children? Do they exhibit similar or different mental health challenges?
I think we're going to start seeing it in the years to come. I think we're going to be able to really start having people who can tell us those stories, unfortunately, pretty soon, because we have to think about all the kids that were separated in 2018 and in 2019 in that first Trump administration. And so those are the first people that I go back and think of. I think about the moms that I was meeting at the time that were telling the stories at the time. And so, first, that trauma of having somebody taken from you and then guards telling you that you deserve this because you're not from here is something that I cannot imagine having to ever process. Like, I can't imagine having to ever deal with that mentally and not have my kid. And then have my kid back and then potentially it not be even my right kid, which is crazy. And then on top of that, how do you deal with the separation that you've encountered? How do you deal with, as a mom, how do you deal with knowing that you did not have your kid for this period of time, that you did not have any control over that, that you couldn't do anything, and that you're never going to be able to fix that? So, as a mom now, it's a different understanding, and then as an immigrant, it's so crazy because it's just, again, you go back to the same thing. You're already living through all these things, right? And then now to add that on top, unimaginable. As a kid, I can't imagine what a lot of these kids are going to be feeling like. I can't imagine what these kids are going to have to be processing, because I think a lot of what we don't talk about is, while the effects of mental health can be very detrimental on that in that moment, a lot of that stuff isn't going to be processed for a couple years. These kids were a lot of them were very young. A lot of them were toddlers, were early, kind of in that early kid stage. And so I think when they get into these key stages of being teens, of being parents, of being adults in this lifetime, I think that we're going to see something processing that a lot of us maybe can't understand, because we don't have that necessarily to grasp onto. Like, we don't have those responses yet. So I think that it's going to be very different trauma upon the different stages, unfortunately, in which we've caused this trauma to people.
You laid it out so perfectly, Andrea. And as you were talking, honestly, it touched my heart because it's like, oh my gosh, I am that child. And now I am that adult that is now analyzing a lot of what I've went through. And so I just appreciate the way you laid it out. Dr. Torres, considering your experience with various generations, how do you believe the impacts of immigrational trauma are transmitted through families, even if they aren't always openly discussed?
I think this is a very important question, very important point for us to consider. I don't mean to generalize much here, but the Latino families are very much tied to their ancestors. We have generations living together, for example. So I am a professor in our history, that is Latino history and sociology and so on. I was thinking about this in what we teach, our history, our sociology, our art. Generations are shown, in the art. My area is literature. So that's my background. For example, El Centro Su Teatro here in Denver performs a work that they call West Side Oratorio. And the main point about West Side Oratorio is the generations. They begin and end with a song called Seven Generations, generations of history. What happened in our ancestry 7 generations ago is still affecting us. And what we do now is going to affect 7 generations, including this struggle for immigration, for the immigrants, right? What we do is going to have an impact on our community. So my point here is that the immigrants, by definition, have to leave the countries that they are from, where they are from, which means they leave their ancestors. My wife and family are here in Denver. I'm from here. I was born just north of Denver. I went to graduate school in one state, started my professor career in California. We came back. We came back here because of the family, because our ancestors are, buried here. So it is, I think, a psychological disruption for the immigrants, actually for anybody who leaves their ancestors, but for the immigrants who actually leave their countries. So I think that is very, very significant. An additional point for the children, the current generation, whether they are U.S. citizens by birth or they're naturalized or they're undocumented, they are constantly afraid. I know this because students have spoken to me. They're constantly afraid that something that they do might affect their families negatively and draw ICE, for example, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, might draw ICE to the family, and then the family will get deported, which could mean a separation of the families. Maybe the father and the oldest child will have to be deported, and the rest stay. I mean, that is a horrible thing to consider. And imagine the children having to face this constant fear that what they do might affect their families. I should say, and as I was thinking about this for this preparation, my father was an immigrant from Mexico after the Mexican Civil War, along with my uncle and 2 aunts. So I grew up here in Fort Lupton. I'm from Fort Lupton, just north of Denver. I grew up afraid that something I would do would cause my father to be deported. And I used to wonder, oh my goodness, if that happens, is mom going to stay here with us, or is she going to leave all of us? Those kinds of things for children to have to encounter. By the way, I ultimately helped my father pass I became an English professor. I helped my father learn how to speak and read a little bit in English, so he could pass a citizenship test in 1965. I didn't realize it, but almost certainly connected to that 1965 law that we talked about just a bit ago. And finally, just briefly here, the constant surveillance. I happen to be reading a book on immigration. It's called Engage and Evade by Dr. Assad, A-S-A-D. Engage and evade. The constant surveillance that they are under almost every day has this debilitating effect on them, I am certain. Whether they are surveilled, that's the term, whether they are surveilled in order to maybe get a job, well, what is your background? Explain your background, etc. Or whether when they take their children to start school and they have to answer all of these questions and so on. Just very, very briefly, imagine, and students have told me this when I try to encourage them to go on to higher education, and they say, well, what if the police stop me? I'm driving to the university and the police stop me. I busted my wife's car's tail light the other day. About 2 weeks ago, I backed up into the garage and I broke it. We couldn't care less. We couldn't care less. For an immigrant who had to be concerned, I can't drive to work today because the police will stop me. I will get arrested and deported. So again, for me, I don't care. I'm not going to change it. I'm going to take it to the shop and have them change it. But that really stands out, I think, this constant surveillance. They have to engage in systems, in social systems. in the school, for healthcare for their children, of course, for the job, pay taxes, even if it's with an ITIN, individual taxpayer identification number, and so on. They have to engage, which is good for them in one way, very, very frightening for another. So I think those kinds of mental health challenges that they have to face are very, very significant.
No, I think those examples speaks volumes because that immigration trauma just doesn't affect one individual. It affects everybody around them, right? Andrea, what are some common misconceptions about immigrant mental health? How can we reduce the stigma surrounding the decision to seek help?
I think the biggest thing I see is a lot of people, because we are so focused. I go back to it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, essentially. And so our needs are so in the physiological, like we're so based on sometimes on the things that bring us to seek a different life, that bring us to seek a life here, are, usually poverty. For some people, it's abuse, right? And so you are so focused throughout your life on being able to escape the situations that I think mental health doesn't, for migrant folks, it doesn't really take a priority, because I don't think it can. Because I think that when you're even just a migrant here in the US, right? We'll talk about, like, growing up, my family, we grew up in an undocumented household. And so when you're working 60 hours and both of your parents are working 60 hours and you guys are really just trying to work, and there's the fear that Dr. Torres is talking about of the constant surveillance of making sure that you're always good and making sure that you're always in line with things, right? Where is that time going to be for mental health? Where is the time going to be to seek that assistance? When is that time to be actually to think about what your needs are mentally, what your needs are in this capacity, because you're trying to feed your kids? Like, I can't imagine my dad seeking therapy when I was 12, 13 years old because he was worried about trying to make sure we were in school, and like if we all got deported, and like what would happen if that happened, right? And like there's just too many moving pieces, I think. And so I feel like it's the same thing when people are coming over. Their journeys are sometimes a year, they're 2 years. They've had to work in different places to be able to get the money to seek on their next journey, right? And so where is this time to take care of yourself? Where is this time to decompress? Where is this time to say, hey, I'm actually going through a lot, and all of this stuff that I'm going through is super valid, and I need to take care of myself? There's no way. How are we going to do it? Because we are so stuck in this physiological need that I think the mental health is like is a dream, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As a follow-up question, we know you have witnessed firsthand the resilience of our community as well. However, it often feels like we are expected to simply deal with it without any support. In your work at Casa de Paz, what types of healing or therapeutic resources do people need the most? Additionally, how can we ensure that mental health care is accessible to everyone, regardless of their immigration status?
I think people coming out of detention definitely need to seek therapy at some point. That would be initial. Need to seek some form of therapy. I know there's a million forms. I think a lot, that's another stigma. I think people in immigrant communities hear therapy and they hear that they're crazy, and they hear that there's something wrong with them, and they hear, because again, it's the stigma behind mental health, right? We're not really educated enough around it. We're not educated enough around what you just mentioned. Being able to deal with things and not being able to do it just on your own is a sign of weakness, right? In a lot of cultures, in a lot of immigrant families. And so I think it's a really hard thing. So I think people need to I think we would have to start with an education around the different forms of therapy and like the importance of mental health first, so people in different cultural backgrounds can understand that therapy is not like there's nothing wrong with you. We all need to be in therapy, to be honest, right? And it's super good for you. It's super healthy for you. But I think that culturally that would be honestly the first step when you're looking at look at how many people are coming from, where these people are coming from. So I think there would be first an education around what that means, because I think if you try to offer therapy to somebody first and they're not really educated around it, they'll just look at you like you've lost your mind. But then I think given that space, because I think again, detention is so dehumanizing and it's such a tough experience for people, and it's such an unimaginable scenario that people go through. And so then to just go on and be expected to like walk out and like live your life like you didn't spend 13 months serving a sentence just because you were seeking asylum. Like you literally, we have the saying, there's that saying, right? Like don't do the crime if you can't commit the time or whatever. Like these people are serving sentences on seeking asylum. So we're letting them just kind of walk away and then like good luck with the rest of your life, even though we took time from you. We took these, like I met a guy who missed his daughter speaking. Like when he first went into detention, his daughter only babbled, and after detention his daughter was speaking for sentences. And so we're taking moments away, we're taking milestones from people, and to then just expect them to kind of walk off and be fine is crazy. But I do think there's the first an education piece around what that means, and then actually appease. Our immigration system is built so that it gives us like I've gone through the system, so you have to do like even to do like your legal permanent residence and your workers permit and all those things, you have to turn in a physical, right? Like make sure you don't have a disease to infect everybody in here for. Why are we not, with the millions and trillions of dollars, offering mental health services to people as a part of the things that they have to do to be able to become part of the society? You want people to be okay, then you're not providing them the resources to be okay. You're just adding to their trauma, but you're not actually providing anything. You're just furthering the different things that people are fleeing. You're further exacerbating that trauma, and then you're like, have a great day. And I think there's that disconnect. So, two different pieces to that.
Yeah, and just to add the cherry on top is that in addition to what you just mentioned, I just have to say that what's even more crazy about the system is like when you say good luck, it's like even though we make them go through such a dehumanizing process, you're still not 100% certain whether you're going to be granted status in the United States, you know? So,
even though you're on bond for like $25,000, there's no guarantee that anything. So, further exacerbating what Dr. Torres was talking about, right? Like this constant surveillance. So now, not only are you in limbo after having milestones and life taken from you, like moments of your life taken from you, now you're also living in uncertainty and no status while paying into the system. Like that's again what I think is crazy in this misconception. Like you, in order for us to be able to become permanent residents, do these things, like you have to pay money. It's not just free stuff. Other orgs are paying the money if you're not paying the money, right? Because that's the great about nonprofit orgs, but it's this misconception. But I do think it's just, yeah, like you said, the cherry on top is just that not only are we doing all this to people, then on top of all of these things, we're letting them live in limbo. We're not even giving them a guarantee of anything.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we all know that there's a great need for culturally relevant care, and there's so much work for all of us to do in that area. And that goes beyond just language. Dr. Torres, what do you believe is the most important factor in ensuring that mental health services are truly supportive for immigrants and refugees?
Yes, I think it's telling that the question is immigrants and refugees, right? Not combining them together. So that made me think, how can we explain who the immigrants are? I mean, those are large numbers, but who are they? And what we hear, what we see and read and hear in the media all the time, excuse me, is about the southern border. But in fact, I had my class figure this out about a couple of weeks ago. How do immigrants get here? If we listen to the media, everybody comes from the southern border, which is not true. It has been some time already, I mean, 10, 15, 20 years ago, approximately 40% of the immigrants, undocumented immigrants, I should say, come through Denver International Airport, O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, Reagan National Airport in DC, and so on. That's a huge number. People can look that up very easily. And what percentage of undocumented immigrants come to the U.S. Through airports, and some a few other entry forms. So what we have been talking about, and I think what most of the listeners would expect to hear, are the immigrants who come through the southern border. I also want to bring up why. I mean, we've talked about people being incarcerated and children being incarcerated. We went through that a few years ago with Donald Trump's administration. Children being separated from their parents and being given not saran wrap, but the tin foil, the tin foil to cover themselves. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. I want to bring up the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, because the 14th Amendment, I have it all written out here, but I'll just read the germane parts. Of course, it refers to citizens, right? For example, part of it in Section 1, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And then there's a colon. And then it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Those are the two big terms, due process and equal protection. They refer to persons, not just citizens. So I think that's very, very important. First, for mental health, right, which has become very significant in the U.S. People discuss the effects of the pandemic, for example. So I think it's important to put all of this in context. We've been talking at most about maybe 60%. By the way, those numbers shift a little bit, 41, 42%, 43%, 39, etc., even up at some reports even up to close to 50%. So in specific answer to your question, we do need a mental health program for immigrants and refugees and asylees and so on. Again, to reiterate, I'm a professor. And I've seen undocumented students, I won't say where I teach, but I've seen undocumented students who are in great need of mental health assistance. But I've seen US born citizens from well-to-do families who are in great need of mental health assistance. Where I teach, where I have taught for quite some time, we have an office that deals with managing mental health challenges. That's the term, managing mental health challenges. For example, one of the reasons that students seek out mental health mental health assistance, I didn't realize this, but student loneliness is very, very prevalent for students between 18 and 28, those 10 years. And one would think students at that age, and people at that age would not suffer from it so much. But the report from the mental health office indicates that we have to, I'm reading, explore the intertwined causes of students' loneliness, the pandemic, social media, and more, structured social connection programs, and so on. And I would ask the listeners to imagine, on top of the usual difficulties that students face, put on top of that finances, the finances that they have or that they don't have. I won't give the figures, but the figures for median net worth, not how much somebody makes, etc., but median net worth. You pay all your bills, you liquidate your belongings, and what is left is median net worth. They simply do not. The families simply do not have enough finances to attend college or university. I've had students, excellent students, who can maybe take 1 or 2 classes per semester instead of the 5 that you need in order to graduate in 4 years. I mean, these brilliant students, they write very, very well, and they are suffering. I could tell they are suffering from the fact that they can't devote themselves to their education. So I think a mental health program, I think colleges and universities, certainly K through 12, should establish these mental health programs to really assist these students. They are contributing to our society. They can do so better if they receive additional assistance.
Thank you for that. I would just add that honestly, they just need to, these departments and systems need to start talking to one another. It's like I think they need to make it a priority. Like they need to start talking to each other because it's there's so much that goes into it, and having to talk to them individually and meet every single department's demands and all of that. And so that would ease some of the barriers we're currently facing. Andrea, what would you say to someone who feels too afraid to seek help due to concerns about their immigration status or their family safety?
There are so many resources, especially nowadays, honestly. I think one of the biggest things is growing up. I grew up in Aurora, as an immigrant. So to that point, what you hear about Aurora is really ironic, nowadays, because it's a 100% absolutely immigrant built city. And it is crazy to say otherwise. But I would just say, especially nowadays, looking at how much we have grown, honestly, Colorado as a state is so blue. I feel like this is not me trying to be mean, but we're even naive to a point of how blue we are, because there's so many resources for all of us. There's so many different things that our community has really fought for, and that's a lot of people. That's a lot of brown people leading the work. That's a lot of people who have been in the work for a long time, who have family or descendants of immigrants, putting in that work to be able to make it happen. And so, like, for example, Metro now has so many opportunities for people who are undocumented, so many different opportunities for students who are undocumented and want to seek even education. So when it comes to mental health, don't be afraid to seek it because of your status. I think that there's so many different pieces that we are afraid of, and mental health is not one of them. That's one of the things that we're actually protected in. And so it is so important to be able to do that. No one is really going to question you, at least not in Colorado. We'll see in Texas, for your immigration status when they're serving you. And so legally they can't. So even if you're having a crisis, and you need to go to the emergency room, they cannot question you, for that. So seek the help, seek the resources. There's so many immigrant communities now. There's so many good upcoming therapists that are people of color that are there also. And so I think with the question that you asked, Dr. Torres, I think when we start seeing a shift of people, of professionals of color getting in the field, I think we'll also see a shift, because I can relate. I think a lot of the times, even just in comedian skits, right? I saw one that said like, it was a Latina comedian, and she was like, "Oh, is your therapist telling you to stop talking to your parents? She's a white therapist. She must not understand you're Mexican, and that's not going to happen, right?" So I think it's we're on our way of reshaping, and so I think when we find those people, if we can enable those systems, if we can give the tools to those people who have the passion to be in these fields and serve in these fields, we should totally do so, because those are the people that are going to have the passion, but also the understanding, the cultural understanding, the life understanding. I think walking in the shoes makes a huge difference in the things and in the communities, and when you're actually out there serving in the community. And so just don't be afraid to do not let your immigration not only not stop you from seeking out mental health services, but don't let that be anything to stop you for anything else. Like, not education wise, not in anything. Like, your immigration status should not be the barrier. And it should not be the barrier now. And we should not let it be the barrier, because we fought so hard up to this point.
Agreed. Dr. Torres, what message would you like to leave our community with, especially for those who might be struggling silently or feeling like there's no way out?
I'd like to follow up on what Ms. Loya just said. You know, there are opportunities, there are resources that they can obtain. I'll go back to about a year ago when there were large numbers of, especially, but not limited to, the Venezuelan immigrants from last year, coming to, especially the three main cities, Denver, Chicago, and New York City. And Denver really took a very positive stance, I will say. And my commendations to the city and county of Denver. And Denver Public Schools, I do some consulting work with Denver Public Schools. I was very impressed with Denver Public Schools as to how they took in all of the students. They provided free breakfast and lunch with some snacks that they could take home. In fact, I was working pretty closely with DPS at the time, and from my over 50 years of teaching. Right, over 50 years of teaching, I would say DPS engaged in probably the most significant educational contribution in Colorado in the last 10, 12, 15 years. I mean, it was very, very positive. Difficulties granted, but also that they really made that effort. My main point, though, and I've been working on this for some time, we need a Denver and a Colorado DACA. A Denver and a Colorado Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. DACA, the federal DACA, well, the DACA that we have had since 2012 was by President Obama. It was an executive order from President Obama. And I and others have been trying to persuade the Denver mayor to issue an executive order, and this goes back to the previous mayor, actually, issue an executive order and create a Denver DACA, and to the governor to create a Colorado DACA. Because, for one thing, this question says, struggling silently or feeling like there's no way out. A Denver DACA and a Colorado DACA would at least show them that their community, the community that they are in, to go back to the 14th Amendment, and to the realization that DACA covered children. Well, children up until the age of 10 cannot commit any crime at all. Nothing, zero crime. They cannot be considered illegal under any circumstance. They shouldn't be taken away from their parents, and so on. Between 11 and 15, the criminal justice system, it isn't a criminal justice system, it's a juvenile system, acts to protect those students. My point is, the students, the undocumented students, arrive here at an average age of 7 years old. Why not have a Denver DACA that can protect them, provide safety for them for deportation, right? That they would not be deported. And then when they get to be old enough to start working, DACA would also provide a work authorization permit. And what else can we, in what other way can we amplify what DACA can do for these students? My last point, the nationwide DACA program was essentially eliminated in 2021, July 16th, 2021, by Judge Hainan, a federal judge in Texas. And I believe there were 8 other states that had also filed with Texas in that lawsuit. So no undocumented immigrant student youth can apply for DACA when they're ready to turn 18. Since then, that is a terrible situation for the students here in Denver and in Colorado, really nationally, to be in. We can fix that. We can ask the mayor, the governor, to create a Denver and a Colorado DACA. We can ask and I have asked them also, the Denver school board members to work with us to approach the mayor and the governor to provide these safety nets for them. People tell me right away, well, we can't do that because immigration is a federal matter. I don't have time to get into rebutting that point. But we certainly can do that. So the main thing that I would ask the people watching this program and their counterparts is to work with us to do that, to make some permanent situation like that, so that the young people would not struggle silently and they would not feel like there's no way out, as your very important question asked.
Thank you to our incredible guests for joining us today and discussing such an important issue. Our conversation has been enlightening, and it's clear that the mental health of our community is closely linked to the broader conversation about immigration. We must continue to support one another, break the silence, and advocate for improved access to care. If you're listening and struggling, know that you are not alone. There are resources available to help. Remember, mental health is just as important as physical health, if not more so. Our community continues to thrive despite the barriers in our way. La comunidad is resilient. Let's commit to supporting one another every day. Thank you for tuning in to We Speak Your Language, and thanks to our sponsor, Caring for Denver. I'm your host, Vivian Reyes. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.